Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
This morning we have good news and we have bad news, unfortunately. The bad news first. State Representative Alice Peisch was supposed to be our speaker this morning on infrastructure, and unfortunately we found out, I think it was Thursday, that she had been hospitalized. And then on Friday I found out that she was having surgery. So, that created quite a problem for us as of Friday afternoon to try to find a replacement. Thanks to Jill Strang, who put a lot of time and effort into it late Friday and on the weekend, we think we have a wonderful speaker for you today. I want to mention again on Alice, that we are going to send around a sheet of paper that we hope all of you will sign. And what we will do is put a copy of that in with a get well card that we have for her, and we'll send that along to her. And I think that will make her feel good that so many people are concerned about her. The last I heard, her situation was not life-threatening, but other than that, I couldn't get much information. But her office has assured me that when she is better, that she would be more than happy to come and speak to us. And so we'll try to set up something either for the fall, or if the schedules just don't mesh, we do have a full line of speakers coming in. If we can't line it up for the fall, we'll have her come in the spring. Okay, so that's good news. This morning, we have Mr. Tad Leugemors, who is the section chief of the Mitigation and Recovery section of the MEMA organization, that's Mass Emergency Management. He recently returned from Texas, observing the disaster down there, and previously he was in Long Island, and he has a lot of experience with crises in this country. Since we are a candidate here in the Massachusetts area for hurricanes and of course global warming, we think that this is going to be an interesting presentation as he talks about possibilities of flooding. For instance, we had the tunnel at Kenmore Square flood a couple of years ago. And areas in places like Situate are often faced with flooding. So we'll learn more about his efforts, his organization's efforts along those lines. What to do with tunnels, airport tunnels. I know Jill was very concerned about the flooding of our tunnels. So that will be another issue that he'll talk about. Evacuation routes, perhaps. And so we should have an interesting session today. So without further ado, our speaker.
So anyway, my name is Thad Leugemors. I joined MEMA in July this year, having spent 12 years in the disaster recovery and mitigation world as in the private sector. I was a consultant, so I worked around the country. I started with Katrina. I've worked Ike, I've worked Sandy, a bunch of little ones you've never heard about, Irene in Vermont, the Front Range floods in Boulder, Colorado. Disasters that to those people they deal with for years and years and years. To most people around the country, you hear about it for a couple of days on the news, and then they go away. The big ones like Texas and Florida, you hear about a little longer. So within MEMA, there's different sections. There's planning, there's response, which are, when we're in first response mode, and then there's mitigation and recovery, which is what I do. So after disaster strikes and prior to, We're constantly trying to mitigate against to lessen the impacts of disasters, but once they do hit, then we are in the cycle of recovering from those through different recovery programs through FEMA mostly, and then we again try to continue to mitigate. So it's a constant cycle of preparing, responding to, recovering from, and mitigating against disasters. That's the constant cycle that we work in. So within my section, I have two sections. Like I said, I have recovery, which when a major disaster hits an area, then you get a federal disaster, or you hear about that in the news. The president declared a disaster, FEMA comes to town, and FEMA will cover the uninsured municipal losses in the wake of a disaster. So your culverts wash out, you had all kinds of overtime to respond to disasters. FEMA will pay typically 75% of the cost of that recovery, but you have to have insurance first. So anything that's insurable, insurance kicks in first. On the mitigation side, we do mitigation projects, both disaster and non-disaster related, and we also do the planning. So our section, you may or may not be aware of this, but states are required to have what we call a hazard mitigation plan. So my section is in charge of identifying the threats that are out there through what's called a THIRA. That's threats, hazards, identification, risk analysis, and then to prepare the hazard mitigation plan, which tries to identify the hazards that are out there and pre-plan how we would respond to those types of disasters. And as of last year, we just had the 1-year anniversary of Executive Order 569, which the governor signed, which puts into law that Massachusetts, and it's the first state to do this, one of the main reasons I like working here, to include climate change adaptation as part of our hazard mitigation plan. So a lot of, typically flood maps and that are based on, here's, what your 100-year flood will be, and it's a static thing, when we all know, witnessed by recent events, that what's your 100-year flood today might be a 25-year flood, 2 years from now. So we're trying to not only plan for the threats that are there, but also plan for the fact that they're going to get worse and worse and worse. And then, of course, a big component of that is the National Flood Insurance Program, which provides flood insurance to people who own homes inside a flood zone, or anybody actually. And so if you're inside a flood zone, you cannot, your homeowner's insurance does not cover flood, no matter what, or even if you're outside a flood zone. So those that you'll hear a lot about what's going on now in Texas, Louisiana, where people were hit by flooding, but they didn't have flood insurance, either because they weren't required to by their mortgage company, or they didn't have a mortgage or whatever. And so now they have insurance that won't, it's not going to cover them. So now they're, a lot of cases have lost everything. So the federal government will step in through potentially to try to help through recovery programs such as individual assistance. You may have heard that, where people can get quick money for up to $28,000 that are the hardest hit. They can document that they have that immediate need. And then longer term programs through what we do through, there's potential for buyouts, there's potential for elevation projects, and those type of grants can come both post-disaster or in annual grants where you just want to plan for those type of eventualities. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. That's sort of the background, the nuts and bolts of what I do. So how does that, sort of translate into the real world? Well, so like I said, we try to mitigate and plan for the recovery of disasters. Most disasters that you hear about, the big ones, both now and dating back to the beginning of this country, are magnified by the mistakes already made by man, right? So does anybody know what the worst hurricane in terms of the loss of life was in this country? And it was 6,000 people or more that died, and it's more deaths than any other combined. Correct. 1900, the city of Galveston, Texas was hit by a major hurricane equal to about what Ike was, probably Category 4. They weren't, sure on the scale that time. But they had built a city on a coastal barrier island that was no more than 6 feet high above sea level at its highest point. So hurricane washed in, they had no way to get off. 6,000 people were killed. Of course, you had the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. A lot of unreinforced masonry, 3,000 people died. Wasn't so much the earthquake as the fires that resulted afterwards. 1889, the Johnstown flood. Anyone ever heard of the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania? Right, so some rich guys built a hunting camp with a lake and a dam above a city, and the worst rains that anyone could remember, which, you know, in geological time is not a long time, hit, broke the dam, 2,200 people were killed. Of course, Katrina, I worked at Katrina. Everyone remembers Katrina because the city of New Orleans was flooded, right? Obviously, it was catastrophic, but the force of the hurricane really didn't hit there. It hit in a little town called Waveland, Mississippi, which was basically wiped off the map. And had New Orleans not flooded, you probably would have heard more about it, but everyone heard about New Orleans because of all the devastation and the money that we're still spending to try to fix New Orleans, and that was mainly because of misguided attempts to control water and then shoddy construction thereof. So most disasters that we have to deal with are magnified by the decisions that man's already made. So we're trying to mitigate against not just new things, but against the old things. So, you know, I always joke, you know, when the Europeans first showed up, you know, on this great land, and the Native Americans said, don't live there, guess what? You shouldn't live there, right? Because once in a while, the ocean will rise up and swallow you if you're not careful. So that is, so, you know, again, you know, the sort of the hubris of man. And then the other thing that we see a lot of is, oh, it can't happen here. It happened in Texas. It can't happen here. Well, that's where I have a little bad news for you. It could happen here. I mean, if we had those type of events here, that type of rainfall, that type of, you know, the Irene event that so affected Vermont in 2011, or was it 2012? They all run together now. Anyway, 2012, I believe, you know, was because a tropical storm, which had been a hurricane, wasn't a very big one, Irene, came up, missed Virginia, where we all thought it was going to hit, and parked itself over Vermont and rained on previously saturated ground for a period of a couple days, you know, and if you remember the news, the devastation that happened there. Now, that could have easily been in the Berkshires. So what do we have? What are the dangers that we have here? So some of the issues that were magnified in Vermont and as in Texas now is we pave over our naturally absorbing ground, and we choose to take our water and put it into pipes and drain it away that way, right? So the water runs on the road, runs out of your yard, runs into the road, runs into drain pipes, gets in. So that works great as long as you don't pour more water into that system than it can handle. Makes sense. But normally what happens, especially like in the Texas type, used to be, you know, prairie type land, is the ground could absorb that kind of water. Now we've gotten away from that. So now everything's based, you know, for the most part on the water getting itself into this drainage system. But again, if that drainage system is failing or even becomes overwhelmed, then you get, you know, what you had happen in Texas. You know, reservoirs fill up. You drive down 9, as I do every day, you see these reservoirs out there. You see a spillway. No water is running over them at this point. However, if you get a reservoir is nothing more than a bucket. Once it's full and you keep pouring water into it, the water is going to come out on the other end as fast as you're pouring it in on that end, right? So, and provided it doesn't fail like it did in Johnstown, you still got to deal with all that water. So we have the drainage system. We also have the channelizing of rivers. So flood rivers like to, they have what we call an alluvial fan. You know, they like to meander like this over time and spread out. And if they flood, you know, think the way that the Mississippi Delta used to work, or the Mekong Delta. You know, the water's high, and in high time it covers the whole thing, it spreads out, and then it goes back into its normal banks during drier times. So what we've done as a sort of a civilization is we've taken those rivers and tried to channelize them and hold them where we want to hold them. right? So right now in Massachusetts, for example, the towns of Salem, or and I'm going to reveal that I'm not from Massachusetts here, Peabody. Well, how do you guys say it? Peabody. Okay, someone told me it was like Peabody or something. So Peabody have rivers that's exactly what's happened. So you get these minor flooding events in strong rain. If you get something catastrophic, the effects are going to be worse. And then, of course, coastal zones, right? So we're very fond of living next to the ocean, which is generally not a good idea. So there's properties in the National Flood Insurance Program that are rated as repetitive loss properties, means they've been hit a couple times and had to pay out flood insurance, which we all pay for, and is an underwater insurance system that is constantly being bailed out by taxpayers. And then they have what we call severe repetitive loss, or SRL properties, which are those that have been hit multiple times to the tune of they've been paid out more than the house is worth. And believe it or not, in Massachusetts, there's over 200 severe repetitive loss properties, and they're mostly coastal. So a little town like Scituate, which is located on sort of unprotected coast, not protected by the Cape, has many severe repetitive loss properties. But those people can get flood insurance. If they get destroyed, they could rebuild. Now they would have to rebuild to the modern standards. But so how do you unring that bell, right? Those towns are there, they exist. I mean, for example, we always used to joke, and it's sort of gallows humor, in the post-event of like dealing with an Irene, there was one road where we had homes that were just completely washed away, and the name of the road was Roaring Branch Creek Road, right? So you might not want to live on Roaring Branch Creek Road. Or Ocean View Drive. I mean, I hate to say this is where you want to live 99 years out of 100, but on that 100th year, it's not a good place. So, and then the last thing is, and this is the one that sort of keeps a lot of us up at night, is earthquakes. So you think, well, earthquakes don't happen here. Well, they haven't happened here in our living memory. They can happen here. The big issue with earthquakes is the unreinforced masonry construction that is prevalent in old, especially old construction northeastern cities. You big, beautiful, in New York, where I'm from, brownstones, right? They're huge, they're heavy, they're built to last as long as the force on them is going down. Once the force does this, they don't hold up too well. So that is that is something that we get on the order of probably 2 or 3. I get situational, we call them situational awareness emails from a system every day, and 2 or 3 times a month there's a minor one in Quebec, a minor earthquake, right? So the one that hit San Francisco in 1906, there had been minor earthquakes for the years leading up to that. They didn't understand what that was at the time. And I'm not trying to scare you, I'm not saying that an earthquake is imminent, but I'm just saying it could happen here. That being said, so how do you deal with that? How do you, like, on my way in here, I had someone, asking me questions about hurricanes and evacuation zones and saying, maybe I've seen the signs or haven't seen the signs. Do we have that? So disaster recovery starts at the individual level and preparedness, right? So if you were, and the problem is most people do it when, it's sort of, they're trying to learn it in real time as a disaster striking. Where do I go? What do I do? Internet's down. How do I get out of town? Those are the things that you could plan for ahead of time. So Mass, our website, MEMA, on mass.gov, and you can certainly just start Googling it. There are evacuation zones for Massachusetts, and it is, it's, you can go on there and they say know your zone, so you could find out where your zone is, what zone you're in. Should you be prepared to evacuate? Have an emergency kits, those kind of things, and then to protect your your assets. Of course, the main thing to do is if you're anywhere near a flood zone, and I always say if you can hear, see, or even smell water, even if you're not in a flood zone, it's good to have flood insurance. If there's any, if you suspect at all that you could ever be affected by flood, then having flood insurance can't hurt. Now we could get into debating how NFIP, keeps the train moving forward with people, with the government subsidizing people developing in the wrong areas. But that being said, while it's it's a system we live under, that system is available to you. So it may be good to consider flood insurance. So that's sort of the canned spiel I had to give everybody. And so what I thought I would do is just kind of open it up to question and answer discussions about our infrastructure. And if you want to ask more about how do we repair the infrastructure, how do you, what happened in Texas, lessons learned that caused all that, I'm certainly, I think that would be the way to go. So any questions? Yes, sir.
I have two questions. I'm sure they're probably covers. The first question is, I've read and heard that in many instances, the government is resisting rebuilding floodplain areas. I know recent experience with New York City, Governor Cuomo said, look, we're going to give you money, you don't build here, you're going to build elsewhere. How restrictive, from your experience, and I know it's difficult with property rights, but how restrictive do you think the government should be? Because it doesn't make sense as a taxpayer to keep rebuilding,
Right.
What do you think?
So what you're speaking of is after Sandy, that there's these grants available through FEMA and through, believe it or not, HUD, CDBG-DR, Community Development Block Grant, disaster relief funds that were, and the billions and billions that were that come into the economy after disaster to do just these type of things: buyouts, elevations, rebuilds, rehabs, that kind of thing. These are the kind of things. The FEMA money is sort of guaranteed by statute. How much damages they're going to give the money. HUD is where Congress can decide how much to give out, and it's like but it never seems to get turned down. When it was Sandy, Ted Cruz said, we shouldn't be spending this money. Now that it's Texas, it's like, give me all the money you can give me, right? So it's going to happen. So, but to your point, how restrictive can they be? To use those grants to do those sorts of things, that can change from disaster to disaster. But really where the problem lies is in the local, so everything lies at the local level, right? So every town that wants to basically get FEMA money participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, where they adopt flood maps, and they have to then, based on those flood maps, issue flood zone ordinances, which is what allows or restricts new construction and rehab and renovation inside the flood zone. So if a disaster were to hit, say, if that type of scenario was to strike in Texas, for example, as it has, whatever the laws on the books at the time that it hit is what's going to dictate how those people can rebuild. So if they get their insurance, or they don't need, government assistance, they can just go forth and rebuild, and they would have to, if their home got substantially damaged, as we call it, they'd have to then rebuild it to the more modern flood code. A lot of them are grandfathered in, like, again, back to like little town like Scituate, or after Ike, I did a buyout of 800 property, $100 million buyout after Ike of a place called Bolivar Peninsula. If you remember the pictures from Ike of everything being wiped out except for one house, that's where I did the buyout. Those people can technically rebuild because their local floodplain ordinance allows for them to build to the new. Now they have to build to the newest ordinance, which, the house might have been built in 1950, so you'd never be able to build it that way now. You got to build it higher and different things. But there's nothing to stop them from, because of exactly what you said, property rights. You're not going to stop them. If the government wanted to curb the building and rebuilding of the flood zones, both coastal and riverine, what they would need to do, in my opinion, and this is pretty well accepted, is they'd have to scale back and phase out flood insurance, right? Because then the private insurers got out of it in the 50s and 60s for exactly that reason. It's just way too, it's not, they lose money, right? So if you're actually to go, say, to the private insurance companies, provide flood insurance, okay, well, we'll provide you flood insurance. It's going to cost you $50 grand a year, right? Because that's the risk we're assuming here, and the problem would take care of itself.
My second question, and I'm not sure this is appropriate. I'm hearing a lot of criticism of the federal government's reaction to Puerto Rico in terms of helping. And I know it's a complicated situation, and I'm not suggesting, but from what I hear, it's comparatively what's happening in Texas or Florida, for example, is a far different response than Puerto Rico. And why is that?
So, your initial instinct is to say, well, they can vote, but or they can't vote, right? So they don't count, whatever. But
I'm not going to back.
But in actuality, I would say, the conspiracy theories aside, really what it is we expect the federal government to step in and to respond to disasters, right? And working with FEMA very closely, they're as strapped for resources as anybody, and they only have a finite number of staff, and they try to staff up and add bodies to do it. But the bad news is they can't react to multiple disasters across the country, all at once on the same scale, right? So, and it's a much different type of. So they just got their airstrip, reopened to where they can, the airport's open now. They're starting to take in flights of relief. The infrastructure's completely crumbled. In Texas, they had water, at least they could drive around. Airports pretty much were open. So it's a whole different animal. That one required the most, you would have had to have, in my opinion, you would have had to have ships standing by with those things ready to land as soon as the hurricane. Now, that would have certainly solved it, but who's going to pay for all that, right? FEMA doesn't have the kind of budget. They only have 2,500 full-time employees, and they have a bunch of reservists and other types. But we can't expect that the federal government can respond to multiple huge events, all at the same time, which is what they're doing right now. We just last week, just to give you back a little inside baseball on what we're doing. As Jose's coming up the coast, we're every day having meetings. We're on the National Weather Service calls. We opened our Emergency Operations Center 2 days before, staffed 24 hours a day, people. Now, lucky for us, it missed, because we knew, had it hit, we would have been on our own. I mean, the New England states were all talking to each other saying, we got, let's be ready, because we're going to support each other. Nothing against FEMA. They're not doing it maliciously. There's only so many people. Yeah, no problem. Yes, sir, I think you. The microphone's coming up.
Or two areas come to mind with me. One is where I live. What is it I do to find out what risk I have and what I should do to protect myself, and what I should do to get on town government to do what they need to protect the town? That's local, number one. Number two, a much greater potential disaster, seems to me, is the city of Boston and flooding in the city of Boston. And so what do citizens do to motivate government to protect the city?
So, two excellent questions. Let's start first with your question about yourself specifically. So, the best thing to do is to, first of all, locate yourself on a flood map. So do you know if you're in a flood zone or near a flood zone?
The Charles River undulates around us, so I'm sure we are.
Yeah, so you could be near it or close. So, if you're into Googling, really you could start looking at your flood maps, your local town. Most towns, and certainly at the state level, you can just say maps, flood maps, and you'll find out. There's one, if you have Google Earth. If you use Google Earth, you can go to the FEMA Maps Service Center, and there's a couple of apps. There's one called Never Dry or Stay Dry, and the other one is the National Flood Hazard Alert. You click on it, and it opens. You could just like Google Earth, you can go right down to your house, and then it'll put the flood map right over, and you'll see where you are. Yeah, so being aware of where you are in a flood zone is, and really, flood zones are what they are, and actually they probably, the way we look at them as, hey, this is a 100-year flood, should be looked at differently, because now, you know, what's a 100-year flood today might be much less next decade, but that's the first thing to do. And then, you know, consider if you think that there's any chance that you would be affected by flood. Homeowners insurance is not going to, if you get flooded, homeowner insurance will not pay. Consider flood insurance, because there's what we call, so everyone's heard of the 100-year flood zone, right? Well, outside of the 100-year flood zone is the 500-year flood zone, and we call it shaded X. So if you're in, you know, in that outer boundary, or even people in Vermont we had that lived near a river, and they were up high on a bank. Well, they were outside the flood zone because they were 20 feet up. Well, guess what happened? The river ate their house. It didn't flood it, it eroded it away. So those type of things, and if you're outside the flood zone, you can get flood insurance cheap. So that's the main thing. If you know, it's, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as my mother would say. So it doesn't hurt to do that. And as far as your town, you know, I mean, their hazard mitigation, you could make sure their hazard mitigation plan is up to date. Most municipalities in Massachusetts, their hazard mitigation plans are always up to date. They have to be updated every 5 years. It's called a hazard mitigation plan, and that would be available, you know, if not online, you could certainly, you know, talk to your town about it. And they have to be updated every 5 years, and that's a condition of being, you know, getting FEMA money and et cetera, so most have it. So then to your second question about the infrastructure in the city of Boston, you know, specifically to flooding. So, you know, there, again, most property is private. Most of it is, you know, so it's going to be up to the individual building owners, et cetera, to be insured. What do they do? But then you get into critical infrastructure like the tunnels. I know people wanted to know about the tunnels. I tried to find out as much as I could. What I could tell you is the fact that they're so new, as opposed to like the Holland Tunnel in New York, which was really, you know, damaged badly by Sandy, but again, they were able to get it functioning. But there's multi-billion dollars worth of repairs still to go in after Sandy in New York City. Is the more modern it is, the more it's going to be built to try to adapt to or try to prevent the damage that you would see from these type of disasters. So I'll give you an example. St. Luke's Hospital in Texas was very badly damaged after Tropical Storm Allison in 2001. They had, you know, most of Houston is a flood zone, and the Texas Medical Center campus is right in a flood zone. So St. Luke's Hospital had been flooded. A lot of their infrastructure is below, you know, at their ground level or below, and they had this system of tunnels, service tunnels that connected everything, right? So $38 million worth of damage, and FEMA paid for the uninsured losses, and then gave them money to mitigate, which they'll do. So this, they installed submarine doors, and something we did in Vermont in the Waterbury State Office Complex. So when the flooding comes, they shut these doors. Guess what? It survived. So they mitigated against it and didn't have the damage. So, you know, it's always a function of how much, you know, if you had enough money, you could do it all. You know, there's not always enough money. In fact, there's never enough money. So they have to make, you know, they have to make the choices. And what can they do? I mean, you stay vocal. I mean, ask questions. Right in the wake of a major disaster, you know, the mayor of Boston was on saying, you know, if the flooding that hit Texas were to occur in Boston, that it would be catastrophic. You know, it would decimate the city. I'm not sure that's true. I think a little bit of, I mean, you would have a lot of flooding, but Boston is, you know, somewhat hilly, right? And the ocean isn't going to rise up. There's two types of flooding. There's what we call alluvial flooding, which is sort of what you'd get in the Berkshires or Vermont, where the water comes and it's a flash flood and it erodes things, it tears them apart and then goes away very quickly, right? That's what happened in Colorado after the Front Range flood. And then you get your more typical, what people see, remember from 1992 and 3, the Mississippi flooding, where the water just has nowhere to go, right? So it comes up and it stays up for like 6 weeks at a time, and then it just goes down very slowly because it's got nowhere to go. That's what you saw in Houston, you know, and it was compounded by the fact they had to open some reservoirs to prevent them from failing completely, which flooded out other neighborhoods. But it's just a function of this water has nowhere to go. There's no way to get rid of it just to let it go down. Boston is more, you know, it would be, that type of rain event would cause all kinds of problems, But for the most part, it's, you know, it would get to sea level, you know, and the ocean can, you know, at this point take as much water as you can give it. So it wouldn't be necessarily the same. It would be bad, but it wouldn't be the same.
Maybe this is part of the same conversation, but I was reading an article about global warming, and according to this report, flooding could occur as far as 10 miles out from Boston, and that towns like Medford would be inundated. Can you give an opinion on that?
Now, are you talking about storm surge, or are you talking about like flooding from? Well, so right, so global. So the effects. So the biggest thing from a hurricane when you're right in the coastal zone is the storm surge, right? So the water, you know, the wind pushes the water. That's what happens, right? So I grew up on Lake Erie, and we always had, you could always tell when it was an offshore breeze day because the beach would be way farther out because the wind was pushing the water towards the other end of the lake, right? So that's what happens. The hurricane pushes the wind in front of it. So if you have, so if you're starting out at a certain level, but now your sea level is 2 meters higher, right? Then I don't know what the math is, but I can tell you that it's going to be able to push that water. It's going to overwhelm the coastal defenses because there are towns, you know, right now in Massachusetts that have barrier walls, you know, sea walls as we call them, those type of things, which would protect you now. But if you know, they're meant to protect to a certain level, you get a 2 foot sea or 2 meter sea level rise. Suddenly, that's not going to stop much, right? So the effect of rising sea levels will mean that hurricanes have the ability to push further inland. As far as flooding from, you know, catastrophic rain events, which you're going to see more of, you know, those type of flood zones occur all over the state in pockets. I live in, you know, moved to Westboro, love the town, but it's full of flood zones because it's very, you know, sort of low areas. You know, I would joke there's a, you know, right next to Scituate, there's a town called Marshfield, right? Why do they call it Marshfield? Because it's a field of marshes, or it was at one time anyway. So those areas those are the type of areas where if we had the catastrophic rain that, you know, we talk about Boston, if you took that type of catastrophic rain that was, you know, unprecedented, and you hate to use those words, you know, unprecedented or, you know, or biblical might be appropriate in here. But that really was. They had to come up, the amount of rainfall, I don't know if you know that fell on the Houston area, they didn't have a color of shading in the, you know, you see the shading of how much rainfall, they didn't have a color for that amount. They had to add like 2 new, you know, colors to show how much rain. If that hit the Berkshires, you'd have massive erosion, and then once it gets down and tried to get to the coast, you'd have massive basin type flooding, which, you know, it can occur. Yes, sir.
This is a political question, so if you choose not to answer, I can understand it. Currently, there are 2 forces that could be affecting FEMA's budget. First, you have repetitive situations, as we've had the last month or two, which tends to give you a lot of support nationally in Congress and with the administration. But on the other hand, you have an administration that doesn't allow you to use the phrase climate change in any of their documents. The EPA administrator has banned climate change in any of the proposals or any of the documents, which tends to dampen the interest in preparing for emergencies, long-term emergencies. Do you care to comment on how these twin forces, opposing forces, are affecting your budget and your ability to do your job?
Sure. So, there's 2 sides to that. The one side is the recovery funding that becomes available post-disaster, which is triggered by the Robert T. Stafford Act of 19 whatever, right? So the FEMA recovery dollars that support infrastructure repair and then mitigation projects under what we call the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, those are fortunately safe because those are dictated by statute how much money will go in. So basically, and there's no limit, right? So if you have, you know, and each little town becomes an applicant. So if you had, say, Wellesley had all this infrastructure damage from an event, and they document that to FEMA, FEMA's on the hook to pay for it regardless of the politics at the moment, which is good, right? So all of the infrastructure damage that happened. And then also the hazard mitigation grant program, which brings in money that can be used to mitigate against, do flooding, sort of, these mitigation projects I talked about, and which also can include, buying out of homes and that type of thing. That is also dictated by the Stafford Act of how much will be available post-disaster. Where it could affect us is we have these non-recurring annual grants, non-disaster grants, annual recurring non-disaster grants that are for mitigation as well. And those are budgeted every year by the federal government, and they're competitive across the nation. We have right now, we're actually in our application cycle right now. The money that's there now was laid out a while ago, so this cycle is not affected. Where that's discretionary, how much money they put available. And that, as you say, has been in the proposed budget, the initial proposed budget was proposed to be cut significantly. But as far as mitigation money, how much difference that makes, it cuts down the grants available to these different applicants across the country. That's not a good thing, right? Obviously it's not a good thing, but the mitigation dollars that are needed nationwide, there's, certainly that's a drop in the bucket anyway. Where this is, and not to stay out of the political realm here, right? Disasters tend not to be too political because everybody wants the money regardless of the color of your state. And I can tell you that most of the states that get hit the hardest, unfortunately, are red states. But so the money that is set to, that in the wake of these huge disasters, FEMA gets together and say, let's take another whole pool of money, in addition to the FEMA money. The FEMA money is already there; it's going to be there. We can't say yes, or we're not going to fund that because they'd have to change the law, the Stafford Act. Is the CDBG money, right, which comes down after these events. And last year I was working the catastrophic flooding in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I mean, that was, people probably don't even remember that now, but Baton Rouge on East got just hammered. I mean, another catastrophic flooding event. They didn't have any problem asking for $1 billion, and they didn't have any problem getting it either, because when two things: when your state is, forget your politics, when your state needs it, you better be asking for it, right, regardless of your election. And the other states tend not to say no. For the most, you get your outliers, crews saying we shouldn't do it, but the other states tend not to say no, because guess what? Next month it's your state, right? So, in recovery dollars, I don't anticipate there would be I don't think there's going to be a big showdown in Congress of we're not going to fund this recovery to Texas. I don't see it happen. But yes, you're correct. In that one area of those mitigation grants that are annually recurring, where a couple years ago, it might have been 100 million. Now they cut it down to 50 or 25 million. That's certainly will affect the number of people that could, not people, but the number of towns that could apply for those. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions I'd like to ask you. One is, you mentioned that you were in Vermont. And Vermont was amazing in the initiatives that just the local people did to get the roads back and help with the flooding. I wondered if you would just share some stories from Vermont. The other question is, I wanted to talk about Houston and building on the floodplains. Why were they allowed to do that? What about the state government?
Okay, yeah, sure. So Vermont was, well, before Massachusetts, was my most cherished, my best project I ever worked, and I hate to say best disaster, that sounds bad, but it was my favorite disaster to go recover from. I helped at the state level. So those that may or may not remember Irene in Vermont, that was their Katrina, right? The videos that showed up on the TV for 2 or 3 days, whatever it was of the, the covered bridges being washed away, which certainly, but Vermont is a mountainous state, as you know, and it's very easy to go north and south. There's several north-south corridors. It's very difficult to go east to west, and every east-west corridor everyone in the state was cut. And it left several towns, like Jamaica being one of them, that were completely isolated. They were a bubble, and you know, with requiring major repairs of roads to get anything into them. So, you know, they started with trying to get in what we call 4x4 roads, where, you know, all-terrain vehicles can get in, and then, but you're talking going up the side of one mountain, down the other, and, you know, where did they build the roads? The same was true in Boulder County, Colorado, which I worked after Vermont, is they build the roads next to the creeks, which, you know, or rivers, because that's the, you know, what's already cut the channel out of the mountain for you to put your road in. So those were all cut. So the town of Jamaica, they actually formulated, you know, the town, the selectmen got together, they would hold daily meetings, and like the townspeople, and when I say the townspeople, there's not many people in that town, they would come together, you know, daily to, you know, share, you know, you got this, I got that. They organized their own sort of recovery effort to start trying to build their way out from their side, right? So just little things happen, those type of things occur, and, you know, you see it occur. Town of Lyons, Colorado was the same way. They were cut everywhere, every way in and out was cut off. So they just sort of, everyone, you know, they got the word out, anyone with you know, a piece of heavy equipment, you know, meet in this town center and we'll figure out what we can do. So, you know, that kind of necessity builds that type of community. But Vermont was, and that was just one example. That happened all over the state. But to your, so to, you know, the Houston question. So Houston, you know, Texas is notorious for, certainly in unincorporated areas, and when I say unincorporated areas, here, you know, we're used to having counties and local governments and cities, and every little inch of a county being incorporated. In fact, they're so incorporated that we don't even have county governments here, right? Back where I'm from in New York, we have all that, and we still have county governments, right? So like Erie County, New York, where I'm from, between school boards and everything, we had like 500 elected officials, right? I always say we'd elect the dog catcher if we could. But Texas has vast areas of what we call unincorporated county, where the only government is the county. And so yes, they don't have classic building codes to some degree, and they don't have classic zoning laws, especially in the city of Houston. It was one, you know, so you get a high rise next to a church, for example. So that is true, but they do, and this is what sometimes when disaster strikes, you have to even educate the Texans themselves on, is that they all participate in national flood insurance, right? So they all do actually have flood zone ordinances that dictate how they can and cannot build in the flood zone. And that, you know, back to the whole, can't happen here. The sad message I have to give you is that those flood zone ordinances, you know, absent a few minor tweaks at the local level that each town can do, are the same exact ones that you have here. So the issues that cause a lot of or the mistakes that caused a lot of that flooding, and again, you know, I don't want to pick on Texas too much. That rainfall was, you know, something unprecedented. But for the most part, their flood ordinances that dictate how they can and can't build or repair or improve their property is the same that we have here. And if something like that were to happen here, the effects, unfortunately, would be the same. And in fact, they may be magnified because of the density of our population. Oh, I'm sorry, gentlemen, I'll get next back there.
Yes, thanks. I understand that the building codes are it's a state building code, where the zonings, of course, are local to each individual town and much more difficult to deal with.
Right.
In respect to the state building code, is there a program by your firm, by your entity, or the larger entities to go through the building codes and produce forms for amelioration of these problems, in light of the fact that the hazardous plans have to be updated each 5 years? Because I don't see a lot of change. I'm involved with the building codes to some extent. I don't see a lot of changes in the building code over years.
Right, good question. And so there is a bit, so there's people talk about the building codes, right? And so here, if it's dictated at the state level, typically they're going to, even at the local level, they're going to just adopt whatever the most current form of the International Building Code happens to be right then, with some changes for wind load and seismic loading and all those kind of things. Then what, and this is where the disconnect happens, even, you know, at the level, the local levels, is they also, every town has adopted a floodplain ordinance, which has its own set of rules about how you build in a floodplain. So if you build in a flood zone or improve your home in a flood zone, you're supposed to also pull a floodplain permit, believe it or not. A lot of towns, and I'm not saying I know this specifically in the towns of Massachusetts, but I've worked in many towns where they're issuing building codes, and I just went through this a year ago. I was in Pasco County, Florida. Homes were flooded in the flood zone, and the building department's issuing repair permits. Wait a minute, they were damaged to more than 50% of their value. They can't repair without making the home 100% compliant with current flood zone ordinances, which in most cases means elevating the structure, right? So especially think if you're on a concrete slab and your first floor was put in the 80s, and now the flood zone, the 100-year flood level, is this high. Well, guess what? Your floor has to be at least, in most cases, a foot above it. So now you want to repair that home, or even if there's no flood and you want to, say, double the size of your home and improve it, you're supposed to pull a floodplain permit, and you got to meet all those codes. But where the disconnect, like I said, lies is a lot of times the building enforcement guys, they don't know their construction. There's a disconnect, and they're issuing building permits. Say, I go repair, and and it's they're not even communicating with their own flood zone department. So that is, so the thing that you could do, you could ask is, whatever town you're in, if it's in part of the NFIP, which I'm sure it is, they then have to have a designated floodplain manager, FPM. So every little town that you have, if they are in the National Flood Insurance Program, they have someone. Hopefully, it's a certified floodplain manager. It might be someone who just got that title because they needed to do it. But those two parts of the building code should be communicating.
I have a question. What is the amount of connection between floodplain awareness and Superfund sites? Which came first?
The amount of awareness between the flood zone and a Superfund site that may or may not exist in or near that flood zone? That's an excellent question. That is one I would, now you got me, I'm going to go back and Google it. Good point, because being from Buffalo, New York, we got plenty of Superfund sites. So what are we got Love Canal too, how are they looked at and how are they mitigated against, if they're, because let's be honest, we're sure they exist, right? Because where did they used to build the factories, right? They built them by the waterway, either for transportation or power. So those Superfund sites exist. Now if they get flooded, you could have all sorts of problems. We'll look at the Japanese nuclear plant, that got hit by the tsunami. They should be, believe it or not, we do have tsunami and inundation maps here. But that is a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I am going to Google it.
I have the answer. There were floods long before the Superfunds were put into law. So the Superfund law came about 30 years ago, but there were floods long before that.
Yeah.
Anyway, my question, what about the refineries and pipelines in the Houston area? Are they all operating now, do you know?
So I don't know if they're all operating now, but I would venture to guess that they are. So the building codes, building codes are not just for buildings. They talk about, they address all those kind of issues too. And, I always say, in any of these cases, who follow the money, right? If they don't get those pipes turned back on, not to oversimplify it, but if they don't get the oil flowing through those pipes, they're going to lose money. So I can't speak specifically, but having been through Ike and other disasters down in Louisiana and Texas, generally the oil refineries and all the oil infrastructure is one of the first things to come back on. Yes, sir.
Is there any program of FEMA or anywhere else that encourages areas that are paved over to be converted to more penetrable surfaces? Because we blacktop everything because of the automobile for parking and related things, and that causes a lot of local flooding. So are there programs to try to convert those paved areas into unpaved areas?
Right. So you're getting into DOT territory, and there are, FHWA, which is Federal Highway, they do pay for betterment type of projects in pre-disaster and post-disaster, and certainly, that has been it's a topic that we address in our climate adaptation planning. So I don't know the specific funding that may be available in those other agencies, but it's definitely, it's a hot topic. In FEMA specifically, I can tell you that one of the post-event, so you get a big flooding event, like I talked about Bolivar Peninsula after Texas, which was the area that was wiped out. So FEMA will come in and offer buyouts to those people through the local municipality. So the local government has to choose to offer this program, because you take these people off the tax rolls, right? Who's going to be A, responsible for the lot, and B, lose the tax money? It's the local. So Galveston County, Texas applies to have a grant to buy out all these homes. And then once they become purchased, they cannot be used for anything, they can't be redeveloped into anything that could be insured, but they can do, if you get enough of them in a row and, whatever, you could do parkland, and you could do those kind of things, which actually is, what should be, in our coastal areas. Like if you took away all of the big expensive homes that are subsidized by the NFIP, it would sort of probably return to green space, and access would open up to everybody, which is, something I'm a proponent of. But at any rate, one of the things you can do in that FEMA program is build parks. They won't pay for it, but you can go fund a park, and provided that, but one of the rules is nothing can be paved. It all has to be pervious pavement types that allow water to flow through. So the post-disaster uses of FEMA-funded buyout lands cannot impede the floodway, flood zone in any form or fashion. So that's one area where FEMA will fund that.
Okay, it's now 10 past, I believe, so we better wrap it up for today. If you have further questions,
yeah, I can hang
I'm
out.
sure Tad would be willing to talk to you further. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks.